Imagine settling into a first-class seat, a reward for years of relentless hard work and determination. It's not just a seat, it's a symbol of success. Then, a flight attendant approaches, asking you to give it up, not for an emergency, but because someone else is deemed more important. What would you do? For Naomi Ellis, this was more than a request. It was a fight for respect. One decisive phone call to her attorney turned the situation on its head, leading to the suspension of the flight crew and sparking a wave of accountability. What happened next? Stay tuned to see how one call changed everything. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We also wish you and your loved ones a warm, joyful, and happy new year. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll be bringing you more amazing stories tomorrow. Now, let's embark on this journey together. The airport hummed with its usual energy, a symphony of rolling suitcases, muffled announcements, and the occasional laughter from travelers who found joy in their journeys. In the midst of the chaos, Naomi Ellis, a poised and confident woman in her mid-40s, strode purposefully through the terminal. Every detail of her appearance, her sleek navy blue blazer, matching carry-on, and perfectly styled hair, spoke volumes about her success. She had earned this. Naomi was no stranger to airports. As a senior executive in the tech industry, she was accustomed to long flights, high-stakes meetings, and demanding schedules. But this trip was different. For once, it wasn't about work. After wrapping up a particularly challenging project that had taken months of sleepless nights and countless sacrifices, Naomi had treated herself to a week-long getaway. She had basked in the tropical sun, far from the cold conference room she usually inhabited. Now, as she prepared to board her flight home, she carried with her a rare sense of peace. She approached the VIP lounge, her first stop before the flight. The door, framed by frosted glass, seemed almost symbolic, a barrier separating the noise of the world from the sanctuary within. Naomi swiped her access pass, smiling, faintly as the light turned green and the door unlocked. Inside, the lounge was a haven of luxury. Plush chairs dotted the space, and a sleek bar offered an array of drinks and snacks. Naomi selected a quiet corner by the window, savoring the calm as she sipped her coffee. The staff greeted her warmly, as they always did, but she couldn't ignore the subtle glances from some of the other travelers. She was used to this, the unspoken questions, the fleeting looks of surprise or discomfort. A black woman in this space, wearing her success unapologetically, still turned heads. Naomi had spent her entire career breaking through barriers, and though she was proud of her accomplishments, she knew her presence often unsettled those who believed the lounge should be reserved for a different type of traveler. She straightened her shoulders and turned her attention to her tablet, scrolling through emails. Yet, even as she immersed herself in her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. A passing airline staff member hesitated near her table, his eyes darting between Naomi and the clipboard in his hands. The moment passed quickly, but it left a faint ripple of unease. Naomi's journey to this point hadn't been easy. Born and raised in the bustling heart of Chicago, she had grown up watching her parents juggle multiple jobs just to make ends meet. Her mother had always reminded her, "You'll have to work twice as hard for half the credit, Naomi. But don't ever let that stop you." And she hadn't. From her first day at university to her rapid rise in the corporate world, Naomi had fought for every inch of her success. She had faced boardrooms full of skeptics, survived whispered doubts about her capabilities, and overcome countless moments of isolation in spaces where she was often the only person who looked like her. Now, she sat in the VIP lounge, a place she had once only dreamed of entering. It wasn't about the luxury, it was about what it represented. Every latte served on fine china, every comfortable chair, every moment of peace was a testament to how far she had come. Still, the sacrifices weighed heavily. Long hours at the office meant missed family gatherings and postponed vacations. She hadn't dated seriously in years, too focused on her career to entertain the idea of settling down. Even her closest friends teased her about her workaholic tendencies. But Naomi knew that these sacrifices weren't just for herself. She carried the hopes of her family and the expectations of those who looked up to her. As she finished her coffee and prepared to board her flight, Naomi allowed herself a moment of gratitude. This VIP seat wasn't just a seat. It was a reward, a symbol of resilience and determination. Naomi rose from her chair and adjusted her carry-on bag, making her way to the gate. The flight attendants were already in position, scanning boarding passes and greeting passengers. She joined the priority boarding line, her ticket firmly in hand. When it was her turn, the gate attendant, a young woman with a nervous smile, hesitated slightly as she looked at Naomi's ticket. It was subtle, barely a pause, but Naomi caught it. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Ellis," the attendant said, her voice overly polite. Naomi nodded and stepped onto the jet bridge. The faint sense of unease from earlier lingered, but she dismissed it. This was her moment to relax, to revel in the quiet luxury of first class. The cabin was a sanctuary of its own. Naomi loved the way the seats were arranged, spacious, with enough room to stretch out and relax. A small lamp illuminated her designated seat, 2A, casting a soft glow that made the plush leather look even more inviting. Naomi settled in, tucking her carry-on into the compartment above her and retrieving a novel she'd been eager to start. She adjusted the recline of her seat and sighed contentedly. For the first time in weeks, she felt the tension in her shoulders begin to melt away. The flight attendants moved efficiently, offering pre-flight beverages and confirming meal preferences. Naomi accepted a glass of sparkling water, taking small sips as she gazed out the window. The runway stretched endlessly beneath the fading light, a fitting backdrop for her thoughts. She let her mind drift. The past week had been a rare indulgence, a chance to breathe and recalibrate. Now, as the plane began to fill with other passengers, she looked forward to a peaceful flight home. Though Naomi's seat was perfect, her instinct told her the calm wouldn't last. A flicker of tension passed through the cabin as a man in an impeccable gray suit entered, his expression sharp and purposeful. He exuded the type of authority that made people step aside, even when he didn't say a word. He scanned the rows as though searching for something or someone. Naomi barely noticed him at first, but the energy in the cabin shifted. A flight attendant standing by the entrance whispered something to a colleague, who nodded and approached the man with urgency. Naomi glanced away, uninterested in whatever minor issue was unfolding. Still, she couldn't shake the faint buzz of tension around her. She sensed the occasional glance from the flight crew, fleeting yet deliberate. She had felt this before, a subtle, intangible scrutiny that didn't require words to make its presence known. Determined not to let it bother her, Naomi returned her attention to her novel. Yet as she read, she couldn't help but wonder, was the source of the tension merely coincidental? Or was something brewing, just beyond her line of sight? The last few passengers boarded, and the cabin door closed with a finality that signaled the beginning of the journey. Naomi reclined her seat slightly, prepared to enjoy the peace she had worked so hard to secure. For now, she chose to believe the turbulence she felt was only in her imagination. But deep down, she couldn't help but brace herself for what might come next. Naomi Ellis adjusted her seatbelt as the aircraft doors sealed shut, signaling the flight's imminent departure. The first-class cabin had settled into a serene rhythm, passengers stowing their belongings, flight attendants moving gracefully through the aisles, and the faint hum of the engines providing a soothing backdrop. Naomi opened her book, allowing herself a rare moment of uninterrupted reading. But the tranquility was fleeting. A few minutes later, a flight attendant approached her row. Her uniform was immaculate, her demeanor polished, but Naomi noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. The name tag read Grace, and though her smile was professional, it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ms. Ellis," Grace began, her voice low and carefully measured, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but we need to discuss your seat." Naomi closed her book and raised an eyebrow. "Is there an issue?" Grace clasped her hands in front of her, an almost apologetic gesture. "We've had a last-minute boarding situation, and one of our priority passengers has requested this seat. We're hoping you could assist us by moving to another available seat in premium economy." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression calm, but unyielding. I don't understand. I booked and paid for this seat in advance. Why would I need to move? Grace's smile tightened. I completely understand, and we wouldn't ask if it weren't important. The passenger has a tight connection and specifically requested your seat for convenience. Naomi's eyes narrowed, her tone firm but composed. Convenience isn't a valid reason to displace someone from their assigned seat. I'm sorry, but I won't be moving. Before Grace could respond, a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit appeared behind her. His presence demanded attention, and he exuded the type of confidence that came from years of getting exactly what he wanted. Naomi didn't need an introduction to recognize him as the so-called priority passenger. The man glanced briefly at Naomi before addressing Grace, as though she were invisible. "Is this the seat?" he asked curtly. Grace nodded. "Yes, Mr. Thompson, but I need it," Mr. Thompson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for debate. "My connecting flight leaves shortly after we land, and this seat puts me closest to the exit." Naomi stared at him, incredulous. "Excuse me, Mr. Thompson, but this is my seat. I paid for it, and I don't see why your connection is my problem." The man's gaze flicked to Naomi for the first time, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Look, I'm not trying to cause an issue here, but I'm a frequent flyer with this airline. They know me. I'm sure they'll compensate you for the inconvenience." Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't need compensation. What I need is for you to respect the fact that this seat is already occupied." Grace's nervousness grew palpable. "Ms. Ellis," she said, her tone soft but insistent, "we truly appreciate your cooperation. It would help us avoid further delays." Naomi met Grace's gaze, her voice steady and measured. "I don't understand why this passenger's preferences take precedence over my rights. I paid for this seat, I boarded on time, and I've done nothing wrong. Why should I move?" Grace faltered, her professional mask slipping momentarily. I understand your frustration, but we're trying to accommodate everyone." "Everyone but me," Naomi countered. The tension between them drew the attention of nearby passengers. A woman in seat 2B peeked over her magazine, her expression one of quiet sympathy. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in 3C frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the unfolding drama. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone neutral but curious. Naomi forced a polite smile. "Apparently, my seat has been requested by someone who thinks their needs are more important than mine." The man in 3C glanced at Mr. Thompson, then back at Naomi. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but quickly thought better of it, turning his attention back to his tablet. Mr. Thompson sighed dramatically, addressing Grace again. "I have a meeting to make, and I don't have time for this. Can't you handle it?" Grace's cheeks flushed. "We're doing our best, sir." Naomi felt her pulse quicken. The words "handle it" hung in the air like a challenge, and she wasn't about to back down. "Let me make this simple," she said, addressing both Grace and Mr. Thompson. "I'm not moving. You're welcome to find another solution, but this seat is mine." Grace glanced toward the galley, as if seeking reinforcements. Moments later, another flight attendant arrived. His name tag read Evan, and his demeanor suggested he'd been briefed on the situation. "Good evening, Ms. Ellis," Evan said, his tone overly polite. "I understand there's been some confusion about seating. We'd like to resolve this quickly." "There's no confusion," Naomi replied evenly. "I booked this seat. I'm sitting in it. That's the end of the story." Evan exchanged a look with Grace before addressing Naomi again. "We're just asking for a little flexibility. It would make things easier for everyone." Naomi's voice sharpened slightly. "Easier for whom?" "Certainly not for me." The murmurs among the first-class passengers grew louder. Some leaned forward in their seats, trying to catch snippets of the conversation. Others exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort with the situation evident. A young woman in 1D, who had been scrolling through her phone, suddenly looked up. "She's right," the woman said softly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "If she paid for the seat, she shouldn't have to move." Naomi turned slightly, offering the woman a brief nod of gratitude. Mr. Thompson, however, was unmoved. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, crossing his arms. "I shouldn't have to argue over a seat. Do you know how much money I spend with this airline?" Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Do you know how much money I spent for this seat? Or does that not matter because it's me sitting here instead of you?" The subtle implication in her words hung heavy in the air. Mr. Thompson's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. As the standoff continued, the tension in the cabin became almost unbearable. Grace and Evan exchanged hushed whispers, clearly unsure how to proceed. Naomi, for her part, refused to waver. She folded her hands in her lap, her posture calm but resolute. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about principle, about standing firm in the face of entitlement and asserting her right to exist in spaces she had earned. She glanced at the window, the runway lights stretching endlessly into the distance. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years, she had fought to climb the corporate ladder, to prove her worth in rooms where she was often underestimated. And now, even here, in a space she had paid to occupy, she was being asked to step aside. But Naomi Ellis didn't back down. Not then, not now. After several long moments, Evan sighed and stepped back. "Let me speak to the captain," he muttered to Grace before disappearing toward the cockpit. Mr. Thompson, still standing in the aisle, shook his head in disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Naomi opened her book again, signaling that she considered the conversation over. She knew the battle wasn't won yet, but she took solace in the fact that she hadn't given an inch. The young woman in 1D caught Naomi's eye again and gave her a small, encouraging smile. Naomi returned the gesture, silently thanking her for the support. The plane's engines rumbled to life, a reminder that time was running out for the crew to resolve the conflict. Naomi remained steadfast, her calm defiance a quiet yet powerful statement. Whatever came next, she was ready. Naomi Ellis remained steadfast in her seat as the tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak. Her calm demeanor had become a quiet act of resistance, and the unease rippled through the space like an invisible storm. Flight attendants Grace and Evan whispered to each other at the front of the plane, their faces tight with anxiety. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson, the self-assured businessman demanding her seat, hovered nearby, his entitlement simmering beneath the surface. Naomi took another slow breath, steadying herself. She knew this moment was about far more than her seat. It was a confrontation with a system that had long been stacked against people like her. But she also knew the next move would be critical. Minutes later, a new figure entered the first-class cabin. Rachel Vaughn, the flight supervisor, had an air of authority that she clearly hoped would de-escalate the situation. Her neatly pressed uniform and confident stride suggested someone who believed in the power of protocol. Rachel approached Naomi's seat, her tone polite but edged with impatience. "Good evening, Ms. Ellis," she began. "I understand there's been some confusion about seating arrangements." Naomi looked up from her book, her expression calm but resolute. "There's no confusion," she replied. "I'm sitting in the seat I booked and paid for." Rachel's professional smile faltered slightly. "I see. However, we have a high-priority passenger who requires this seat due to time-sensitive travel needs. We'd greatly appreciate your cooperation in relocating." Naomi folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady. "I've already explained this to your crew. I'm not moving. If there's an actual emergency, I'd be willing to discuss it. But this is about convenience, not necessity." Rachel's expression hardened, though she tried to maintain her composure. "Ms. Ellis, we're simply asking for a small accommodation to ensure a smooth experience for everyone involved." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "And I'm asking for the same thing, to sit in the seat I purchased without being harassed." Before Rachel could respond, Naomi's phone vibrated in her jacket pocket. She retrieved it, noting the familiar name flashing on the screen. Martin Reynolds, her trusted friend and a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in the country. She had texted him earlier, sensing the need for backup, and now he was calling back. "Excuse me," Naomi said coolly, raising the phone to her ear. "I need to take this." Rachel hesitated but stepped back, clearly perturbed by Naomi's lack of submission. "Martin," Naomi said, her voice low but firm. I need your advice. On the other end, Martin's deep voice was steady and reassuring. What's going on? Naomi quickly explained the situation. The persistent demands to give up her seat, the lack of a legitimate reason, and the growing pressure from the flight crew. It's clear this isn't about logistics, she added. It feels personal. Martin didn't miss a beat. Stay where you are, he said firmly. They have no grounds to move you. If they continue to pressure you, I'll draft a statement to their corporate legal team tonight. And if this escalates, we'll go public. Naomi felt a surge of relief, but kept her tone measured. Thank you. I just needed to hear that I'm not overreacting. You're not, Martin replied. And if they don't back down, remind them that any attempt to remove you could lead to legal and reputational consequences for the airline. You're well within your rights. As Naomi ended the call, she noticed Rachel, Grace, and Evan watching her from a distance. Though they couldn't hear Martin's exact words, the confidence in Naomi's tone seemed to rattle them. Naomi slipped her phone back into her pocket, turning her attention to Rachel. I've just spoken with my legal counsel, she said evenly. He assures me that I'm fully within my rights to remain in this seat. If this airline decides to take further action, we'll address it through the appropriate channels. Rachel's composure wavered. Ms. Ellis, there's no need to escalate this further. Naomi raised an eyebrow. I'm not the one escalating it. I've stated my position multiple times, and yet here we are. Grace and Evan exchanged uneasy glances, and even Mr. Thompson seemed momentarily thrown off balance. The confidence he'd carried into the cabin now appeared shaky, as if Naomi's calm defiance had exposed a weakness in his entitlement. Meanwhile, the first-class passengers, who had been quietly observing the standoff, began to stir. The young woman in 1D spoke up again, her voice louder this time. She's absolutely right. Why should she have to move for someone else's convenience? The older man in 3C, who had initially avoided involvement, nodded slowly. If she paid for the seat, that should be the end of it. Their words carried weight, shifting the dynamics. In the cabin, Rachel glanced around, realizing that the growing support for Naomi could turn the situation into a public relations nightmare. Naomi met the eyes of the passengers who had spoken up, offering a subtle nod of gratitude. She felt a spark of solidarity that emboldened her resolve. Rachel's confidence continued to erode. She stepped aside to huddle with Grace and Evan, her voice low but urgent. Naomi couldn't make out the exact words, but the occasional glance in her direction made it clear they were reconsidering their approach. At the same time, Mr. Thompson's frustration boiled over. This is ridiculous, he snapped, addressing Rachel. I shouldn't have to deal with this level of incompetence. Just move her and be done with it. Rachel winced, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Sir, we're doing our best to resolve this as quickly as possible. Naomi's gaze hardened. Perhaps Mr. Thompson should reflect on why he feels entitled to demand someone else's seat in the first place. The pointed remark drew a few muffled chuckles from nearby passengers, further undermining Mr. Thompson's authority in the situation. His face flushed, but he said nothing. As the tension reached its breaking point, Naomi's phone vibrated again. This time, it was a text from Claudia Harper, the CEO of her company. Naomi had shared her predicament with Claudia earlier, knowing her boss was not only a powerful ally, but also someone with significant media connections. The text was brief but direct. If this isn't resolved immediately, I'll make some calls. Let me know. Naomi smiled faintly. She knew that if Claudia intervened, the airline would have more to contend with than just a disgruntled passenger. She looked up at Rachel, her voice calm but firm. I should let you know that my company's CEO is aware of this situation. She's prepared to involve both legal counsel and media contacts if necessary. Rachel paled visibly. The implication was clear. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience for a single passenger. It was a potential public relations disaster waiting to unfold. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel turned to Mr. Thompson. Sir, she said carefully, we can offer you another seat that will still provide expedited deplaning. We'll also arrange for ground staff to assist you upon arrival. Mr. Thompson's expression darkened. This is unacceptable. I understand, Rachel replied, her tone conciliatory. But this, is the best solution we can offer at this time. For a moment, it seemed as though Mr. Thompson might continue to argue. But the mounting pressure from the other passengers and the visible shift in the crew's stance finally forced him to relent. With a huff of frustration, he turned and stalked toward the seat Rachel had arranged for him. Naomi exhaled slowly, relief washing over her as the tension in the cabin began to dissipate. As Grace and Evan resumed their duties, Rachel approached Naomi one final time. "Ms. Ellis," she said softly, "I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience this has caused. If there's anything we could do to make your flight more comfortable, please let us know." Naomi met Rachel's gaze, her expression neutral. "Thank you. I'd prefer to enjoy the rest of my flight in peace." Rachel nodded, retreating without another word. Naomi leaned back in her seat, the hum of the engines a welcome contrast to the earlier chaos. Though the victory felt small, it was significant. She had stood her ground, not just for herself but for anyone who had ever been made to feel out of place in spaces they had rightfully earned. The flight continued, and though the cabin eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, Naomi knew the ripples of this confrontation would extend far beyond this journey. Her phone buzzed again, a follow-up text from Claudia. "Proud of you for holding your ground. Let me know when you land." Naomi smiled faintly, her resolve stronger than ever. This was just one battle, but it was a reminder that some victories, no matter how small, could spark change in ways no one could predict. As the airplane climbed to its cruising altitude, the tension in the first-class cabin lingered like an unspoken question. Naomi Ellis sat in her seat, outwardly calm but acutely aware of the storm brewing around her. The air felt thick, charged with the energy of unresolved conflict, and though the immediate confrontation had subsided, its ripples were spreading in every direction. Not long after takeoff, the curtain at the front of the cabin shifted, and a tall man in a crisp pilot's uniform stepped through. Captain James Kerr, with his neatly groomed mustache and confident stride, exuded authority. He glanced briefly around the first-class section before stopping near Naomi's row. "Good evening, Ms. Ellis," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I've been informed of the situation regarding your seat. I'd like to discuss it with you to ensure we can resolve this amicably." Naomi met his gaze, her expression steady. "Captain Kerr, I appreciate your concern, but as I've explained to your crew, I'm sitting in the seat I booked and paid for. I'm not sure why this has escalated to your attention." The captain's jaw tightened subtly, though his expression remained neutral. "I understand your perspective, ma'am. However, we aim to accommodate all our passengers, and occasionally that means making adjustments." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Adjustments for convenience or necessity? Because so far, I've heard nothing that justifies displacing me from my seat." Behind the captain, Flight Supervisor Rachel Vaughn hovered nervously, her arms folded as if bracing herself for the captain's response. Kerr sighed. "Ms. Ellis, let me be frank. This situation has caused some disruption, and I'd like to avoid further escalation. Perhaps there's a way to reach a compromise." Naomi leaned back slightly, folding her arms. "The only compromise I'm willing to accept is remaining in the seat I purchased. If that's not acceptable, perhaps your airline should reevaluate its policies." The firmness in her tone left no room for negotiation. The captain nodded once, though his eyes flickered with frustration. "Very well, Ms. Ellis. I'll ensure this is documented appropriately." He turned to Rachel, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative tone. "Let's not drag this out any further. Focus on providing the best service to all passengers for the remainder of the flight." Rachel nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line, and stepped back toward the galley. While the cabin appeared to settle, the airline's internal channels buzzed with activity. A crew member had overheard fragments of Naomi's earlier phone call and discreetly relayed the details to the operations team on the ground. At Skylink Airlines Operations Center, Sandra Whitmore, the regional manager, was alerted to a brewing situation on Flight 512. She quickly reviewed the report. A first-class passenger alleging discriminatory treatment, a potential social media storm, and whispers of legal involvement. Sandra's heart sank. She grabbed her phone and dialed the flight supervisor's line. Rachel answered, her voice tight with tension. Rachel, Sandra said sharply, what the hell is going on up there? I just received a report that one of your passengers contacted legal counsel mid-flight and hinted at media exposure. Is this true? Rachel hesitated, choosing her words carefully. The passenger, Ms. Ellis, refused to give up her seat for Mr. Thompson. She claimed discrimination and mentioned speaking with her lawyer. And you allowed this to escalate? Sandra demanded. Do you realize how catastrophic this could be for the airline? This is already circulating internally, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's on social media by the time you land. Rachel swallowed hard. I thought we could handle it on board. But she's been firm, and now passengers are taking her side. Sandra's voice dropped, ice cold. Fix it. Immediately. Offer her an apology, compensation, whatever it takes. We cannot afford this going public. As the crew scrambled to contain the situation, the passengers in first class grew increasingly vocal. Melissa Carter, the young woman in 1D, spoke up again, this time addressing the cabin as much as the crew. Honestly, I think Ms. Ellis has been incredibly patient. It's absurd that this has gone on for so long. The older man in 3C nodded in agreement. She's handled this with more grace than most people would. If the airline had just respected her seat from the beginning, we wouldn't be dealing with this delay. Across the aisle, a businessman grumbled under his breath, clearly irritated. I don't care who's right or wrong. I just want the flight to proceed without all this drama. But the murmurs of support for Naomi grew louder, creating a wave of solidarity that even the crew couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Mr. Thompson sat stiffly in his reassigned seat, his expression dark with frustration. He glanced at his phone, likely composing a message to someone higher up in the airlines. Hierarchy. Yet even he seemed to sense that the tide was turning against him. Less than an hour into the flight, the first signs of real repercussions began to emerge. Naomi's earlier call to Martin Reynolds had set off a chain reaction. Unbeknownst to the crew, Martin had contacted a journalist friend who worked for a major online news outlet. The friend, intrigued by the story's potential, had reached out to Skylink Airlines for a comment. By the time Sandra received the media inquiry, her worst fears were confirmed. The journalist had phrased the question bluntly. Is Skylink Airlines aware of allegations of discriminatory treatment against a first-class passenger on Flight 512? Sandra's response was swift. She called Rachel again, her voice a mixture of panic and fury. Do not, under any circumstances, take further action against Ms. Ellis. When you land, we'll initiate a full review, but for now, treat her like royalty. Am I clear? Rachel stammered an acknowledgement before ending the call. Back in the cabin, Naomi noticed the subtle shift in the crew's demeanor. Grace approached her seat, her expression softer than before. Ms. Ellis, she said quietly, can I get you anything? Another drink, perhaps? Naomi regarded her carefully. I'm fine, thank you. Grace hesitated, then added, I'd like to personally apologize for the inconvenience earlier. We should have handled the situation better. Naomi nodded, sensing the sincerity in her words. I appreciate that. The apology, while welcome, did little to erase the frustration Naomi felt. Still, she recognized it as a sign that her earlier stand had made an impact. As the plane soared through the night sky, the first-class cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Yet beneath the surface, the fallout from the confrontation continued to unfold. Mr. Thompson remained rigid in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Naomi noticed him glancing at the flight attendants occasionally, as if waiting for an opportunity to reclaim the narrative. But the murmurs among the passengers made it clear that his position had lost its strength. For Naomi, the remainder of the flight was a mix of relief and lingering tension. She leaned back in her seat, allowing herself to exhale fully for the first time since boarding. Though the situation wasn't entirely resolved, she knew she had stood her ground, and that her actions had sparked a ripple effect she could only begin to comprehend. As the plane began its descent into Philadelphia, Naomi's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Martin. Heads up, a journalist might contact you soon. Your story is already making waves. Naomi stared at the message, a mixture of exhaustion and resolve washing over her. The battle wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. The wheels of the plane touched down on the tarmac with a jarring thud, signaling the end of the turbulent flight. For Naomi Ellis, the landing brought not relief, but the promise of yet another confrontation. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, she prepared herself for what awaited on the ground, a reckoning that had been brewing since the moment she refused to surrender her seat. The flight attendants were visibly tense as the plane came to a halt. Rachel Vaughn, the flight supervisor, avoided Naomi's gaze as she walked through the cabin, her earlier authority reduced to uncertainty. Mr. Thompson, the businessman whose entitlement had triggered the ordeal, sat rigidly in his reassigned seat, his face a mask of simmering anger. As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began to collect their belongings. Naomi remained seated, watching as two sharply dressed airline representatives boarded the plane and conferred briefly with Captain Kerr. Their presence was impossible to ignore, an indication that the incident had reached the airline's upper management. One of the representatives, Sophia Bennett, approached Naomi's seat with a warm but strained smile. "Ms. Ellis," she said, her voice carefully modulated, "I'm Sophia Bennett, Director of Customer Relations for Skylink Airlines. I'd like to personally escort you off the plane and ensure we address this matter appropriately." Naomi stood, her posture composed yet unyielding. "I trust that means you're taking this situation seriously," she said, her tone measured. Sophia nodded, gesturing toward the jet bridge. "If you'll follow me, we can discuss this further in a private setting." As Naomi collected her belongings, murmurs rippled through the first-class cabin. Several passengers gave her subtle nods of encouragement, while others, including Mr. Thompson, stared in silence. Naomi felt the weight of their eyes, but focused solely on her goal, accountability. Once off the plane, Naomi was led to a private lounge near the gate. Inside, a small group of senior airline staff awaited her, their expressions ranging from concern to thinly veiled panic. Among them was Alan Crawford, the airline's regional operations manager, whose grim demeanor suggested he was well aware of the stakes. "Ms. Ellis," Alan began, extending a hand, "let me start by offering our sincerest apologies for the events that transpired on your flight. What you experienced does not reflect Skylink Airlines' values or policies." Naomi shook his hand, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "We've already initiated an internal review," Alan said, his voice firm but conciliatory. "The cabin crew involved have been removed from duty pending further investigation. We take allegations of discrimination very seriously." Naomi crossed her arms. "I appreciate the apology, but words alone won't suffice. This isn't just about me. It's about systemic issues that allow situations like this to occur in the first place." Sophia, who had been standing quietly nearby, spoke up. "Ms. Ellis, I assure you, we are committed to meaningful change. We've already scheduled mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, and we're reviewing our policies to prevent similar incidents in the future." Naomi's gaze was unwavering. "I'll hold you to that, and I trust that your actions will be as swift as your words." Meanwhile, Rachel Vaughn and her crew were summoned to a separate room for an urgent debriefing. The mood was tense, with Rachel flanked by Grace and Evan, their earlier confidence now replaced by palpable unease. Alan Crawford entered the room, his stern expression silencing any attempts at preemptive justification. "Let's get one thing clear," Alan began, his voice cold. "The events on Flight 512 have already reached our corporate office and the media. We're now in damage control mode, and this situation is entirely unacceptable." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but Alan cut her off. "Save it. I don't want excuses. I want accountability. Did you, or did you not pressure a passenger to vacate their assigned seat without a legitimate reason?" Rachel hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Yes, but we thought." "You thought wrong," Alan snapped. "And now we're facing a potential PR disaster because of your poor judgment." Grace shifted uncomfortably, her voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't mean to cause harm. We were just following protocol." "Protocol?" Alan's voice rose. "Protocol doesn't include treating passengers differently based on perceived importance, or worse, implicit bias. Do you have any idea how damaging this is for our airline's reputation? The room fell silent as Alan's words sank in. Moments later, he delivered the final blow. Effective immediately, you're all suspended pending further review. Depending on the findings, termination is likely. I suggest you use this time to reflect on your actions. Rachel's face drained of color, and Grace looked on the verge of tears. Evan, who had remained stoic throughout, simply nodded, as if accepting his fate. By the time Naomi reached the baggage claim area, Skylink Airlines had already begun damage control. A press release was issued within hours, addressing the incident with calculated precision. Skylink Airlines deeply regrets the events that occurred on Flight 512 involving Ms. Naomi Ellis, a valued customer. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and are taking immediate action to address this matter. The employees involved have been suspended, and we are conducting a thorough investigation. Additionally, we are implementing enhanced training programs to ensure all passengers are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. The statement circulated rapidly, accompanied by news articles detailing the incident. Headlines like Skylink crew suspended after VIP seat dispute and passengers call exposes airline bias flooded social media, sparking heated discussions. Naomi's story became a rallying cry for those who had faced similar injustices. Comments poured in, ranging from praise for her courage to calls for boycotts of the airline until meaningful change was enacted. As the story gained momentum, Naomi found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't anticipated. Messages flooded her inbox, some from friends and colleagues, others from strangers who shared their own experiences of subtle and overt discrimination. One email stood out. Thank you for standing your ground. Your courage has inspired me to speak up about the biases I face every day. Together, we can make a difference. Naomi read the message twice, feeling a swell of emotion. She hadn't sought the spotlight, but now that she was in it, she understood the power of her actions. Her refusal to yield had not only upheld her own dignity, but also illuminated a broader issue that demanded attention. Days later, Naomi received a personal invitation to meet with Skylink Airlines CEO, Jonathan Hayes, at their corporate headquarters. The meeting, held in a sleek conference room overlooking the city skyline, was both an apology and a promise. Ms. Ellis, Jonathan began, his tone earnest. I want to personally thank you for bringing this issue to light. What happened to you was unacceptable, and as CEO, I take full responsibility for ensuring it never happens again. Naomi regarded him thoughtfully. It's encouraging to hear that, but words need to be backed by action. What steps are you taking to ensure meaningful change? Jonathan outlined the airline's plans: comprehensive diversity and inclusion training, a review of all employee protocols, and the establishment of a passenger advocacy committee to address concerns in real time. He also offered Naomi a formal apology and a lifetime first-class membership as a gesture of goodwill. Naomi accepted the apology, but made it clear that her primary concern was systemic change. This isn't just about me, she said. It's about creating a culture where every passenger feels respected and valued. As Naomi left the meeting, she felt a sense of closure, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The incident on Flight 512 had been a catalyst for change, not just for Skylink Airlines, but for countless others who had experienced similar injustices. In the weeks that followed, Naomi continued to use her platform to advocate for equity and inclusion. She spoke at conferences, shared her story in interviews, and encouraged others to stand up for their rights. One evening, as she sat on her balcony overlooking the city, Naomi reflected on the journey that had brought her here. One phone call, one act of defiance, had sparked a ripple effect she could never have imagined. It was a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the power to create change often begins with a single voice refusing to be silenced. And that, Naomi knew, was a victory worth celebrating. After the plane landed, Naomi Ellis found herself not just the focal point of a personal story about resilience and courage, but also at the epicenter of a national conversation. Her refusal to yield her seat had sparked something far greater than she could have anticipated. The incident on Flight 512 had become a lightning rod for discussions about fairness, systemic biases, and the subtle but pervasive inequalities that often go unchallenged in society. In the days following the flight, Naomi was inundated with thousands of messages and emails. Strangers from all walks of life reached out to share their own experiences with discrimination, some overt and others insidious. These stories painted a picture of an issue far larger than one airline or one passenger. Determined to use her platform effectively, Naomi partnered with Equal Wings Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for passenger rights and equity in the aviation industry. Together, they organized a press conference in downtown Philadelphia, where Naomi shared her story in her own words. "What I experienced is not an isolated incident," Naomi began, her voice steady as she addressed the sea of reporters and cameras before her. "It's a reflection of a system that allows implicit biases to dictate how people are treated. I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm standing up for everyone who has ever been made to feel out of place in a space they rightfully earned." Her words struck a chord. Within hours, clips from the press conference went viral, and hashtags like #FlyFair, #EqualSeats, and #EndImplicitBias began trending across social media platforms. Public figures, activists, and even some politicians joined the conversation, calling for systemic reform not just in the aviation industry, but across other sectors where similar biases often went unchecked. The public outcry placed immense pressure on airlines worldwide. Skylink Airlines, already in damage control mode, issued follow-up statements outlining their commitment to addressing the issue. However, they weren't the only ones under scrutiny. Activists and media outlets began examining other airlines, uncovering similar complaints of discriminatory treatment. Major carriers scrambled to respond. Some announced plans to overhaul their training programs, partnering with diversity and inclusion experts to educate staff on recognizing and combating implicit biases. Others promised increased transparency in handling passenger complaints and pledged to implement reforms aimed at ensuring equitable treatment for all travelers. Naomi didn't stop at accepting these promises at face value. She used her growing platform to demand tangible accountability, challenging airlines to share data on bias-related complaints and detail how they intended to address them. In one televised interview, she posed a powerful question. "If we don't understand the scope of the problem, how can we ever hope to fix it?" Her advocacy culminated in a congressional hearing where Naomi testified alongside other victims of discrimination in travel. Lawmakers introduced the Passenger Rights and Equality Act, a bill that aimed to enforce strict anti-discrimination policies across the aviation industry. Naomi's testimony, delivered with clarity and conviction, was broadcast nationwide, inspiring viewers to demand better from an industry they had long trusted. In the months that followed, signs of progress began to emerge. Skylink Airlines took the lead in implementing changes, establishing a passenger advocacy unit to address complaints quickly and fairly. They also introduced comprehensive training programs that went beyond surface-level discussions of diversity, delving into the systemic nature of bias and its impact on decision-making. Other airlines followed suit, launching similar initiatives to rebuild trust with their customers. The impact of these reforms was felt not just by passengers but also by airline employees, many of whom expressed gratitude for the chance to learn and grow in their roles. Naomi received a heartfelt email from a young flight attendant who had participated in one of the new training programs. "I didn't realize how much my own unconscious biases influenced the way I interacted with passengers," the email read. "Thank you for standing up and making this happen. You've changed the way I approach my job and the way I see the world." Naomi read the message twice, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and determination. For every step forward, she knew there were countless more to take. The changes she had fought for were real and meaningful, but they were just the beginning. Despite the successes, Naomi was acutely aware of the challenges that remained. Some smaller airlines resisted change, citing costs and logistical challenges as excuses. Meanwhile, stories of discrimination in other industries began surfacing, reminding her that bias was not confined to the skies. But Naomi was undeterred. She continued her partnership with Equal Wings Initiative, working to create a universal framework that all airlines could adopt, regardless of size or budget. This framework included not only robust training programs, but also strategies for fostering a culture of inclusion from the ground up. One evening, as Naomi reviewed feedback from her latest speaking engagement, she received a message that left her momentarily speechless. It was from a young woman who had attended the event. The message read, "Thank you for sharing your story. You've given me the courage to stand up for myself in ways I never thought possible. Because of you, I believe change is possible." Naomi reflected on the impact her journey had already made. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she also knew that each small victory was a step closer to a more equitable world. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for it. On a crisp autumn evening, Naomi sat on her balcony overlooking the city skyline. The lights of Philadelphia stretched out before her, a testament to the resilience and determination that defined her journey. She thought about the countless people who had shared their stories with her, each one a reminder of why this fight mattered. One call, one act of defiance, had sparked a movement she could never have anticipated. It had shown her that change often starts with a single voice willing to challenge the status quo. And while the challenges ahead were daunting, Naomi felt a deep sense of purpose. For her, this was more than a personal victory. It was a call to action, a reminder that when people stand together, even the most entrenched systems can be transformed. And that, Naomi knew, was a journey worth taking. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. And remember to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on our upcoming inspirational tales. See you in the next one.